Okay, so first, before we get into the different types of momentum, let's go ahead and look at the performance of momentum. Obviously, we don't really care about the different types if it doesn't perform well over time. So, same as value, we're going to look at the S&P 500 as a benchmark. We're using the momentum data from the Fama French data set, and this actually comes from Wes Gray's book, Qualitative Momentum. The only difference here is the dates are slightly different than the value slide, and we're looking at compound annual growth rate instead of average return. So you can see the S&P 500 had right around 10%, as we discussed last time, and momentum data set, its performance came in at 16.85%. So just under 17%. So we can obviously look at this and see that momentum is a strategy that certainly works, and works well. So now let's go ahead and take a look at the different types of momentum. And there are two types that we're going to look at. The first is called cross-sectional momentum. This is kind of the fancy academic word for relative momentum, which is basically a stock's price momentum compared to all other stocks' past performance in the universe that we're looking at. Now I say the universe we're looking at because we could compare against other microcap stocks or the S&P 500 stocks, large cap stocks, anything. But whatever your universe is, this is how one stock's price momentum compares to the others. So as an example, let's say that the GE stock has gone up 20% over the last 3 months, and AT&T stock T has gone up 5% over that same time period. So as a cross-sectional momentum investor, or relative momentum investor, which stock or stocks would we invest in? And the answer here is that you would invest in GE stock, as it has significantly outperformed our universe here, which is only two stocks, basically AT&T. So in this case, you'd probably go long GE, and you'd either short or sell AT&T stock. So the second type of momentum that we will look at is called time series momentum, and once again this is the fancy academic term for what practitioners would call absolute momentum, or more popularly trend following. And this is basically a stock's price momentum compared to its own past performance. So we're not looking at a stock relative to any other stock in our universe, we're only looking at its own past performance. So once again, as an example here, we have GE and AT&T in our universe. GE stock has gone up 20% over the last 3 months. AT&T stock has gone up 5% over the last 3 months. So the question would be, what stock or stocks would a time series momentum or absolute momentum investor invest in? And the answer is both. We'd invest in both GE and AT&T stock because they both have performed favorably compared to their own past, in this case over the last 3 months. So it wasn't exactly a trick question, but it's something that sometimes throws people, because since they're both positive, and if your look back period happens to be 3 months, then you would most likely invest in both of these stocks. So something really fascinating here about momentum is the different time frames or look back periods that one uses changes the results that happen from performance back tests. So for example, the last 2 slides we used 3 months. As you'll see here, this falls into one of our 3 different time frames. So we have short-term look back period, which is basically less than a month. And interestingly, stocks tend to reverse their momentum. So for example, if a stock is up for 2 weeks, then the next 2 weeks it tends to be down. And there's variations of that. The next time frame that we'll look at is the 3 to 12 month look back periods, sometimes called middle term or intermediate term time frame, and stocks tend to continue their momentum. So in the literature, in all of the academic papers, you'll look at that most of these have a 12-month look-back period minus the most previous month. So it's actually 2 to 12 is kind of what the look-back period is. And that's obviously because they're trying to take out the short-term mean reversal that we saw in number 1 there, the short-term momentum. And finally, we have long-term time frame. And this is 3 to 5 year look-back period. And in this one, also very interestingly, stocks tend to reverse their momentum. And this is actually kind of where you see your value investing come in, because you would buy stocks that are beat down, that have been having a negative price momentum over the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and you'll notice that stocks tend to reverse their momentum at that point. So it's time for a quick check on learning. Let's do a review of what we learned about momentum investing. The first thing we learned is that intermediate term momentum investing has performed well over time, almost 17% compound annual growth rate from 1927 to 2014. And remember, this was compared to our benchmark of the S&P 500, which returned right around 10%. And we also learned that there are different types or flavors of momentum investing, namely 2. The first was cross-sectional or relative momentum, which we talked about was comparing all of your stocks in a universe that you choose and comparing their price performance relatively. The second was time series or absolute momentum, sometimes known as trend following. And this was just looking at a single stock and seeing how its performance has been over some look-back period. We also learned that there are different time frames for momentum, and they yield different results. So it's important to know, if you're a momentum investor, what time frame, what look-back period you're using to make your judgments. So we learned that short-term and long-term momentum tend to reverse or mean revert, and middle-term or intermediate-term momentum tends to persist, it tends to continue. And just as somewhat of a little teaser, we didn't learn this, but it's actually a simple strategy to implement. Now we'll get into this next in the, more in the next section when we actually go into implementation details.